Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you, Stacey, and good evening, and Shana Tova to all those who celebrated. I want to start a little bit with noting the Jewish festivals, because when these elections were first called, the first thing that most noted was that a big part of the campaign season, the sort of lead up with, usually the most intense period of campaign, will actually be slap bang in the middle of the Jewish holidays. And so far, we already had Rosh Hashanah earlier in the week, Sunday night, Monday, Tuesday. And in Israel, even amongst those who are not necessarily religious or observant, they are days off. They are days where you spend with the family. They are maybe even days where you go to the beach or go to, to the national parks or something like that. But the fact is, this period, next week we'll have Yom Kippur, the week after we'll have the first part of Sukkot, and then the intermediate days, and then the second part of Sukkot, and then really we only have 2 weeks pretty much until elections. So there was that feeling that this would be a relatively different campaign season, election period, and it's proving to a certain extent to be true, so much so that one of the biggest political commentators today, who has a Telegram channel which is busy night and day, every 5 minutes posting something, has posted very little in the last few days, and his name's Amit Segal, for those who know him, and he even said he was so bored today, he started looking at irrelevant statistics from previous elections. He had nothing new to say, because it's really been quite a slow period in the last week or so, with everyone sort of getting in the mood for Rosh Hashanah, and now it's the lead up to Yom Kippur. These holidays, sometimes they're the weekends, you don't really miss the working week. This year we actually have all the Jewish holidays right in the middle of the week, so we're going to be missing more and more time. So a lot more people are not at work, not at their computers, and are not really focused on things apart from their family and vacation, pretty much. So that's the first thing that really needs to be said at this period. What we did have last week is we did have a very interesting speech at the UN. We touched on it last week, but the speech was actually given by interim Prime Minister, if you like, Yair Lapid, at the United Nations on Thursday, where he did talk about what had been released the night before, and that's why we were able to touch on it, the fact that he would be endorsing a 2 states for 2 people solution during his speech. Now, in years gone by, there wouldn't necessarily have been such an exciting or unique element. Many prime ministers mentioned it, many prime ministers promoted it, but it certainly hasn't been something that has been talked about much in Israeli politics in recent years, primarily because there's a belief amongst Israelis there simply is no partner on the other side. And especially that's borne out by the violence that we're seeing emanating pretty much every day from major Palestinian cities. The most controversial thing that was said about this is not necessarily an endorsement by a left of center leader of pretty much that sort of a policy, is the fact that Yair Lapid said that this is a position supported by the majority of Israelis. If he would have made that comment maybe 10 years ago, maybe a bit more, he would have been undoubtedly correct. But we've seen over the last number of years a real waning of support. It is my firm belief that if there was a partner on the other side, if there was a deal, if there was a feeling that peace is around the corner, a majority of Israelis probably would sign on to a 2 states for 2 people. And that second part is just as important as the first, because the Palestinians always talk about 2 states, but never about 2 states for 2 people. So it's very important when an Israeli leader uses the whole phraseology. It's very important. And I can respond to any questions on that, the importance of that, because that's something that I dealt with when I was in the Israeli government. But the statement that that most Israelis are supportive of two states for two people solution was not borne out by any poll that I've seen in recent years. It's not a strong plurality against, but certainly there is no majority for it, simply because there is no belief that it can happen, simply because there's no eagerness for it, and it really hasn't been on the agenda. So here was Yair Lapid's attempt to sort of sort of state a claim for why to vote for Yesh Atid. They were probably the first party on the political map to make a significant statement on the what's called the political process, the Israeli-Palestinian, quote unquote, peace process. But as one can imagine, he got support from the left, some saying on the far left, well, it's very nice to say that, but we need more than words. As one can imagine on the right, he got slammed for it. Interestingly, the Likud came out and, all sorts of attacks. They shouldn't have said such a thing. You can't support a two states for two people. And to say at the UN was ridiculous and everything else. Yesh Atid's response was to show a speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu, not a couple of years ago, I can't remember exactly, 3-4 years ago, where he actually said pretty much the same thing. So as I said, it's usually rhetoric. The fact that Lapid brought it up at this point is probably to try and differentiate himself. What it did do is it certainly made it more uncomfortable for his closest competitor, which is Benny Gantz of the National Unity Party. The reason it made it uncomfortable for him is because, as we've said in the past, his party is an amalgamation of political views, some center-left within his party, and Gadi Eisenkot, the former IDF chief of staff, who is definitely on the left on those issues and stated his support for a two-state solution relatively recently, and even, I think, attacked settlements, etc., or Israel's policies in Judea and Samaria. On the right of the party, and a major player, number 2 on the list, is Gideon Sa'ar, who makes up a third to a half of the initial 10 candidates. And his party is vehemently, or at least the majority of his candidates are vehemently against the two-state solution. So what we did hear from Benny Gantz, who gave quite a few interviews subsequent to Prime Minister Lapid's speech, sort of had to find that middle ground where he wouldn't annoy either of his partners. So he talked about two entities, which is usually used by people who don't want to say the word states, but it's a sort of a wink and a nod to those who are supportive. Again, that was probably something that was worked out as a compromise between his differing parts, and it just, Lapid probably realizes at this point this is good to push them on the back foot and try and differentiate these two center-left parties, one from the other. Where it certainly was greeted, let's say, to a certain extent, was by the Labour Party. Merav Michaeli of the Labour Party, which was the historic left-wing party, left-of-centre party, which was the ruling party for just shy of 3 decades, has been looking for something to get their hands on to, again, try and grow their support, because they are battling not just with Lapid and Gantz on their so-called right, but Meretz on their left. According to the most recent poll, they're down to 5, I think it was, 5 seats. So they're really struggling. But certainly the issue of the Palestinians buoyed them a little bit, to the point where, and this is certainly going to be an interesting move, they decided to hold a rally on the anniversary of the assassination of former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. It's usually held on, I believe, October 29th. Usually it's held in Kikar Rabin Square, where he was assassinated in Tel Aviv. But this year they're going to hold it in Kikar Zion, Zion Square in Jerusalem. Now, why is that significant? Because first of all, it's taking that message into the heart of right-wing Israel, which is Jerusalem. And also their point is that this is where the incitement that led to Rabin, this is their point of view, this is where the incitement, there were famous images of people shouting death to Rabin and all sorts of things in a rally in Zion Square. And even there's pictures of then head of opposition, Benjamin Netanyahu, sort of egging on the supporters. There's been some dishonest splicing of videos to try and show that Netanyahu himself was egging on the death to Rabin. There's no proof that he heard those particular chants, and he was just egging on the supporters, which was a right-wing demonstration. But the fact that this will take place 2 days before the election certainly is going to probably buoy either camp. There may even be, I don't know if violence will happen, but there will certainly be some heated exchanges on the streets of Jerusalem. So certainly the issue of Rabin, his legacy, Oslo, the Palestinians, is coming back to the forefront a little bit. It hasn't grabbed as much attention as perhaps some would like, those who are seeking some sort of two-state solution. But it is there, and it has returned for the first time, I would argue, in at least half a dozen elections. It hasn't been an issue, but the fact is it's become an issue also because of the violence that's emanating from Judea and Samaria, from the Palestinian Authority towns. Israel, in Operation Break the Wave, has been in the towns and cities of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, pretty much day after day, night after night. There was a big operation today. They took out a small cell which was planning attacks. Apparently there's another cell, but Israeli forces are there pretty much every day, putting their lives on the line to try and stop these cells with these different armed groups, sometimes lone wolves, as they call them, trying to perpetrate attacks left, right, and center. So the security issue is there. It's a bit of a difficult one because Netanyahu likes to be known as Mr. Security. He can't really attack this government for lack of doing what's necessary inside these terrorist operation centers, because quite simply he didn't do anything close to what's being done now on the streets of Jenin, Nablus, Shechem, and other places. So it's a bit of a difficult one for him, and he's certainly not playing up those security credentials as much as he would have if he would have been leading these operations, and with the success rate that they're finding with the arrests, with the neutralizing, as they call it, of terrorist night after night. The interesting thing is we had our first poll. Israelis are addicted to polls, so they build this as the first one of the new year. And there was a couple of interesting tidbits that came out of this poll that was released tonight. First of all, that after quite a few successive polls which showed that the right-wing religious bloc led by former Prime Minister Netanyahu had been getting 60, 61, 62 for the first time in at least a few weeks. His bloc actually went down to 59. Interestingly enough, the 2 seats which appeared to be lost were from the Likud party. Now, again, who knows? I mean, when they do these polls, it's a few hundred people. Sometimes they twist them a little bit to get a headline. Sometimes if 1 or 2 people that they approach go for another party, then it just changes the whole complexion. So I wouldn't read too much into it, but perhaps there is something to read. Again, we'll see what the trend is. But another interesting thing to note about it is that what people are saying could happen if Bibi doesn't get his 61 is that he could reach across the aisle to Benny Gantz. Now, Benny Gantz's price for entering the government could be very high, especially if Netanyahu is desperate and needs him. And one of them would be that he would come in without the religious Zionist party, Bezalel Smotrich. He has claimed that he wants to form a government without the extremes. He talks about Balad and the joint list on the left and the religious Zionists on the right. But according to this poll, with Benny Gantz getting 13 and the religious Zionist party on 12, even if that scenario were to happen, a Bibi or a Gantz-led right-wing religious coalition still would not get 60. So according to this poll, and according to the commentators who introduced it, they wouldn't be surprised if we're already starting to think about another date in April for the next round of elections. I think it's a little bit too early to say. Again, we'll have to see what the trends are. If this continues to be a trend and Likud and the Likud-run bloc do weaken significantly in the polls ahead, then perhaps that is something, but we've still got a bit of time to go. Finally, there was a little bit of drama that came out of Israeli politics tonight when Amichai Shikli, the former renegade Yamina MK, who basically voted against the government and the formation of the government and the government all the way through, and was given a reserved spot on the Likud list. He would sort of got pride of place on Likud, on Netanyahu's reserved spots on Likud, has been ruled as not eligible to run by the elections committee. The excuse was given that there was a deal that was made that Shikli would resign from the Knesset and then he'd be able to run with an existing party in the next Knesset, but he didn't resign in time. This will be taken to the Supreme Court. The likelihood is, I would suggest, is that he will be allowed to run. But certainly it was quite a shock to see that, especially when Idit Silman, who was another renegade Yamina MK, who was the one pretty much to bring down the government, came at a much later stage and had voted with the government for best part of a year, was ruled eligible to run. So I think the likelihood is at the end of the day that both of them will be able to run, but we'll never know. So there was a little bit of drama after a relatively quiet few days. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about these issues or anything else that's on your mind.
All right, thank you so much. We have a few questions coming in. Larry, we've talked about this before, but Larry would like to know, would Likud win to form a government if Netanyahu were to step aside as head of the party?
Likud, I mean, that's the problem with saying a party or a person wins Israeli elections. It doesn't work as cleanly as, it's not like in the US elections where, you know, one party wins or a leader wins. There's no real winning on the night of elections because no party has ever in the history of the state got 61 votes. So let's put that aside. What has usually happened, at least up until last year, was that Netanyahu got enough to form a coalition. Ever since 2009, I think it was, up until last year, he did enough to form a coalition, whether his natural bloc or reaching across the aisle, he always managed to form a coalition. So at the moment, Netanyahu run Likud would certainly be the strongest party by far. Even according to the latest poll, I think they're at least 8 to 10 seats ahead of their biggest rivals, which is Yesh Atid. So there's very little likelihood that Likud will not be the largest party come election day with Netanyahu at the helm. What would happen if Netanyahu were to step aside is it would probably make it more easy for Likud to form a government. Why? Because there are quite a few, even in this current government, who are right-wing, who are, you know, politically, ideologically natural allies of the Likud and the right-wing religious bloc, but they will not sit in a government with Netanyahu because of personal, ideological differences with Netanyahu. Some say he's turned to the left, some say it's all about him, some say he's a danger to the country because of various reasons. So if Netanyahu were to leave, then people like Saar, maybe Lieberman, some others would probably be able to return to the Likud, or if not, the right-wing religious bloc. So probably it would be easier to form a government without Netanyahu, but Likud would certainly do better. The problem is for those who want to see that, is it's very hard to get him out. The Likud bylaws internally make it very difficult. He holds on to most of the choice committees within the Likud. There is no obvious candidate to take over. There's a few quite low down as far as polls are concerned, and even they can't agree on one particular challenger. The one challenger who came out in the past was dropped down the list, so it shows that if you come against Netanyahu, you're going to suffer in the Likud. So at the moment, it's not a relevant question. It will probably make it easier for the Likud to form a coalition without Netanyahu, but he's not going anywhere. So at the moment, all their bets are on Netanyahu. If he's not able to form a government this time, they say that the knives will be out and there'll be people who will turn on him, but we've heard some of these things before. Obviously, at some point, it has to get louder and it has to get more aggressive to try and put him aside. And as I've said before, my particular belief is that if anyone is going to depose Netanyahu, it will come from the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, someone like Moshe Gafni. So that's a long way of saying it's not relevant at the moment, but it will probably be easier without Netanyahu to form a government.
Thank you. Michael Kerbel asks, do you believe that the Arab Party will be part of the next government? And following up on that, did any of the Arab parties give a public statement on the UN speech?
Well, first of all, there are two Arab parties running these elections. Actually, there's three. Only two are expected to pass the electoral threshold. Before there were four parties, and Ram broke off from the joint list, and now Balad have broken off from the joint list, and they're not expected to pass. Interestingly enough, the two Arab parties left in are on four, according to the latest poll, which is very close to the electoral threshold themselves. Everything will depend on the mood of the Arab street on the day of elections. Do they feel motivated? Do they feel that their vote will affect any change? There's a lot of different processes happening in the Arab street. Some want to become more integrated and are happy with what Ram brought to the table and trying to be part of a government. Others are, well, look, their efforts failed. Nothing really changed for us, so we have to return to more extremist parties. At the moment, Ram could certainly be part of a Gantz or Lapid-led government. Likud have ruled it out, but we know they've negotiated with Ram in the past. But it was vetoed by Bezalel Smotrich, who they will certainly need after elections. Bezalel Smotrich, according to polls, brings 12, whereas Ram only brings 4. So there is a major, major difference there. It's not like Gantz, which is only one difference. As far as the joint list, that was the most interesting thing to come out of a wave of interviews that Prime Minister Lapid gave to all the Israeli papers ahead of the Jewish New Year. That was a question that was asked by every single interviewer. Can you imagine a government either with the joint list inside or at least reliant on them? And he was mostly evasive. His argument was, well, they also said that they won't be part of a government, so it's irrelevant, or until the results are known, I can't ask hypothetical questions. In one, he got closer to saying no. It's a difficult one for him because on the one hand, he may need them. On the other hand, he doesn't want to say he needs them at this stage because that could intensify the Likud attacks on him that he basically needs to be reliant on anti-Zionist Arab parties. At the moment, a left of center government run by Lapid, although according to the poll tonight, including all the parties currently in the government, was on 57, not a million miles away from the 61, and probably the closest they've been. Still, without the joint list, they have no chance of getting over that 61. So Lapid can't really rule it out at this point because that may be his only chance to return to the premiership. As far as reactions to the Lapid speech, I don't think Ram said anything, at least I didn't read anything. And the joint list basically, to the best of my knowledge, called it cynical. And if you really cared about it, you would actually do something about it. But again, it wasn't, the reaction wasn't as big as many would have hoped, even in Yesh Atid, to sort of rebound upon and make it an issue. So the most obvious ones were the religious Zionists and the Likud, and then you had Michaeli and Zava Galon of the left-wing Labour and Meretz parties, respectively.
Thank you. Christoph Gastenschmidt asks, what is the sense of a two-state solution now, especially as it has not been implemented ever since it came on the table?
Well, if it had been implemented, it would need to be raised again. I mean, it's as I've said. I think I when I mentioned it last week, it was more for internal Israeli consumption. It got plaudits from the Biden administration and other administrations, and even Abbas, who gave a speech, I believe, the day after. Most of the speech was its usual: Israel is terrible, Israel's apartheid, Israel. It gave a whole litany of history of Israeli massacres, quote unquote. But he did credit Lapid with mentioning it. So, there is some credit out there. But my belief is it was primarily for internal purposes. There is no movement forward. There are no meetings between Lapid and Abbas. Interestingly enough, Abbas called two people to wish them Shana Tova, the traditional greeting for the Jewish New Year. He called Israeli President Herzog, and he called Defense Minister Gantz. I did not see any mention of a call to Prime Minister Lapid. So, if they're not even able to give each other greetings at this point, there are no negotiations. There's no even talk of negotiations. So the issue really just simply isn't on the table, regardless of whether it's mentioned at a UN speech.
Thank you. Carrie Hillibrand asked, if two states for two peoples in some form is not an ultimate goal, how will Israel prevent Jews from becoming a minority in the land? And you mentioned that you could expand upon the two states for two people. Could you?
Yes. Well, I can tell you one thing. I was in a meeting at the UN many years ago with the Deputy Foreign Minister, and every year at the UN, there is a meeting of the donors conference where the whole international community talks about how much it's going to give the Palestinian community. Rarely they give what they said that they are, especially in the Arab world, but usually there's a communique, a press release, a joint one that comes out from the Israeli and Palestinian teams. And we were sitting with Salam Fayyad, who was the moderate Palestinian Prime Minister at the time. And in the communique, which I was involved with, was written two states for two people. He refused to sign it as long as it said, and for two peoples. He said, two states I'm fine with, not for two peoples. And the point is there, well, what are we talking about? What the greatest fear is in Israel is, yes, they'll sign on for two-state solution, but essentially they'll continue to, they'll take one state, the Palestinian state, and they'll continue to work against towards the end of the other state. They won't recognize it as a Jewish state. Abbas has said it many times. So who are these two peoples? So it's very problematic for the Palestinians, and you'll never see a Palestinian leader ever use that terminology. As far as the problem with the Jewish minority, I always say one thing. There's a lot of supporters of the status quo, and other people who say, well, if you leave it the way it is with the Arab birth rates, the Jews are going to be a minority between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River within a certain amount of time, if not already. But the point is, first of all, Gaza has already basically been given over to the Palestinians. It's not part of sovereign Israel. Israel has no sovereignty there. It's given it away. And the second thing is there is no history precedent or international tool to force Israeli sovereignty over the Green Line into Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, which means that regardless of if the Palestinians tomorrow decided we're not going to be pushing for a Palestinian state, tomorrow we want to have equal rights, we want to have citizenship, Israel will not give it, because that means that they would annex the territory, and they know annexing the territory would be a demographic problem, and that's why no government, right wing, left wing, whatever it is, has ever even really seriously attempted to do it, because they know inherently the problems. So there is no real rush to do this for demographic problems, because there's no possible way the international community could say to Israel, okay, annex the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and give everybody their citizenship. It just simply, there is no precedent anywhere in the world. There are precedents for taking territory away. We look at the former Yugoslavia and many other places, but there's never been a situation where the international community rules that a territory is now part of another country against its will. So I've always found it's a little bit of a weak argument, but this is something that will keep on coming up, especially as I would say the majority of the Israelis are sitting somewhere in the middle. They're not for necessarily a two-state solution at this point, and they're certainly not for annexation. They're more for the current status quo, if anything.
All right, and in our last minute here, let's shift gears just a bit. Jack Wasserman asked, does any party have a position regarding Lebanon and their upcoming presidential election? What are the implications of Arafat's nephew replacing Abbas when he finally dies?
As parliamentary elections, first of all, I should say. Second of all, no, Lebanon isn't really an issue. I mean, it's an issue for the Israeli government. It's certainly an issue over the maritime border discussions, and certainly the security establishment is very worried about what's going on there, especially with the unrest and the economic uncertainty. But it's not a major issue for any party that I've seen on the political map. And even if it was, like, what would their policies be? You know, no one's talking about re-entering Lebanon, no one's talking about annexing territory. Certainly, you know, many of the parties on the right will be saying we should have a harder, we should deal harder with our enemies in general, but I don't think anyone would focus any of their major campaign manifestos on Lebanon.
All right. Thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast, Ashley. Thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Zuhdi Jasser discussing Islamist versus Muslim reformists, how the battle has evolved. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.